Hey everybody, I'm very fortunate to have an amazing human being here with me today, Mark Martinez. He is the founder of Crop Ministries. And I just want to have a full disclosure here. I am a board member of Crop before we get into this conversation. But just to kick things off right now, for people that don't know Mark, what is Crop Ministries and why does it matter so much?
So, CROP is a nonprofit organization, and I like to refer to it as a community, basically a community of families that share common beliefs and shared values, which as a result direct our intentions on raising our kids. There's been a huge vacuum, I think, in a sense, in our culture where a lot of the raising of our kids is abdicated to the schools or to the churches or to the sports or whatever it may be, without parents necessarily either taking ownership on raising their kids and preparing them for what it means to be an adult, or simply they just don't have the tools themselves. They've never maybe received that from their own parents. They don't really understand what it means and or how to pass on legacy and how to pass on teachings and mentorship to their sons and their daughters. And so, in that vacuum, in that absence of that vacuum, oftentimes conflict arises when young people enter the preteen and the early teen years. And rather than waiting for the fallout of that to happen, Prop is intentional in working with families and working with families that have typically preteen and teen kids, early teen kids, to say, hey, listen, you're taking your first steps into adulthood. And we, as moms or dads or grandmas and grandpas or whatever adult mentors may be, are want to be intentional in making sure that we prepare you for all the decisions that are eventually going to come your way so that you'll be equipped on not just what to think, but how to think. You'll also be equipped on how to make good decisions. You can also know in advance where poor decisions can lead to so that you stay away from that path. And so that's kind of the idea of crop is as a community together, parents, grandparents, young teens, preteens, we are intentional and deliberate in teaching them and preparing them for what it means to be an adult and all that life has in store for them.
Very good. So I met you in 2015, and I remember we were at a mixer, business mixer, and at the time, your focus was more on being a mortgage broker, although this was your baby and you were very interested in this. In fact, you were one of the first clients I ever had when I was helping you produce content for it. So nowadays, I know you're not a mortgage broker anymore. This is your full-time endeavor. What prompted you initially to create Crop, and why is it so important to you?
Yeah, I think that's a good and it's an important question, and it leads to a great story. So, I have two daughters, and how the idea behind Crop came is when my youngest daughter, or I'm sorry, when my oldest daughter was 12 years old, about to turn 13. I just finished reading this book, and this book is titled "Already Gone," and the subtitle is "Why Your Kids Will Quit Church and What You Can Do to Stop It." It's a book written by Ken Ham and Britt Beamer, and it was basically a research book. They researched thousands of people who had grown up in the church, went to Sunday school, went to youth groups, etc.
Mhm.
And they discovered by the time that these people reached their mid to late 20s, three out of four of them had disengaged from the church. Three out of four had walked away from the faith that they had grown up in and been mentored in. And this, after reading this book, it struck me: who am I to think that my kid's going to be the one out of four that doesn't disengage unless I do something intentional and deliberate to help her prepare for life? And the two things that came out of that book was, when did this disengagement start? It started typically in the middle school years in terms of a mental disengagement. And what were the influences that led to this disengagement? And it was the cultural influences that not only today's kids, but all of us faced at one time or another when we were growing up, whether it was addictions and substance abuse and sexuality or peer pressure or bullying or all kinds of other different things like that. Those were all the influences. And so after completing this book and my daughter about to turn 13, I just felt like it was my responsibility to prepare her for the things that were going to come. And so I told her, I said, when she asked me what I was going to get her for her birthday, I said, I wanted to do something for you. I just haven't had a chance to put it together. And I explained to her how many cultures around the world have what's called a rite of passage. A rite of passage is just simply recognizing that children transition into their first steps of adulthood, and that there is a ceremonial process to prepare them for that. Of course, the most common one is the Jewish bar mitzvah. I think people that's been around since the fourth century, and a lot of people are familiar with that as a cultural rite of passage for Jewish boys and girls. Well, Native American Indians, Latino culture, Asian cultures, African cultures, they all had this rite of passage that recognized this transition. And I never found anything that was comprehensive and intentional in teaching and preparing our kids from a Christian perspective.
Mm.
So I told my daughter I wanted to mentor her through a rite of passage program so that she would learn how to make good decisions. And I asked her if she would like me to do that. She said yes. Quite frankly, I was a little bit surprised because I wasn't. I thought she might say yes, but at the same time, I thought she might say no. And if she said no, that would have probably ended it there.
Mhm.
But a few days after she had said yes, I just felt like God was provoking me to say with these simple words, invite others, invite others, invite others. And so a few days later, I went back to her and I just said, hey, remember we talked about this rite of passage program from the Christian perspective? I just feel like I'm being provoked to invite other people, such as your friends and their dads. Would you like to do that? And she said yes. And so that's kind of basically how Crop launched. We gathered together once a week for a couple of hours, daughters with dads. And we took a list of topics that I had written out that I thought were important to teach our sons and daughters about. And each week we would take a topic and we do a deep dive on it so that we can help our girls understand how to make a good decision. Well, what happened is that as we were going through this program, the families going through it would eventually talk to other families, whether they were on sports teams or schools or whatever. And these other families would say, well, I want to do that for my kid.
Mhm.
And so when we graduated our daughters, then I started another group. And same thing, those families said, I want to do that with my kids. So then when we graduated them, we started another group. And so that's kind of how CROP came into being. And what CROP stands for, it stands for Christian Rite of Passage. That's where the term comes from. Christian Rite of Passage is what CROP stands for. So as I mentioned, it's basically helping you families and working with families with preteens and teens to have a specific faith-based program that allows them and teaches them how to make good decisions in life so that they don't accidentally derail their life.
I want to talk about rites of passage in just a moment, especially when it comes to boys. But before we do, I want to go back to one of the earlier things that you mentioned. I can't help but think that due to the declining numbers of people that are members of churches, there is something going on culturally. Obviously, I didn't grow up in the 1950s or even earlier, the 1940s, the 1930s, but it seems to me that we had a stronger sense of connection to the church then, and obviously we had a much stronger connection in the 1800s and the 1700s. What is going on culturally right now in the year 2024, almost 2025? Actually, I think this will probably publish in 2025. What is going on right now that is leading people away from the church, especially our young people?
Okay, so I want to be real honest and transparent in this respect is, and this is what I teach the kids and the families. There are two things that are constantly competing for your mind, your heart, your spirit, and your soul. It's the message of culture and the message of Christ. And they're in contrast with one another. They're in opposition with one another. And the message of culture typically is a message that leads to enticement and seduction and entitlement and self-absorption and self-indulgence. And oftentimes it leads to things like discouragement, depression, disengagement, and even death. The message of Christ, on the other hand, leads to the fact that God wants us to have a life, an abundant and a fulfilling life. But what happens is the message of culture is A, it's deceitful, and B, it's attractive. And so what happens is that in our nuclear family and our neighborhood used to be our primary influence in our lives. Now this is.
Right.
Now this is. And so all the enticements, all the attractions, all the seductions that you can possibly have are obtained through this now. And so as a result, kids tend to be drawn towards those things. And what do we see on this? We see people who are all about, like I said, self-indulgence and fame and this fake and false narrative, a metaverse, as oftentimes referred to, which is this alternative reality of where people live, and it's not really true. A lot of the stuff that's on here is what is fabricated, but the consumers, the youth, the kids that see this don't look at it that way. They look at it as being real. And so what happens is then they start measuring their own life against this fabricated life that they see online, and it leads to this spiraling. And also through this process is that kids are not only placing less value on the influence of their parents, but quite frankly, we don't have the same nuclear families that we had before. You know, we the number of childbirths out of wedlock, the number of divorces that we have, these are all contributors to this sliding away from this nuclear family that has a faith-based orientation. And so that's the battle we're in. And so all we can do and all that I focus on is helping those that I can help, you know, and we've got to focus on the ones that we can help and bringing people into the community and just making sure we understand that there's a lot of things in life that happen that aren't necessarily your fault. You know, if your parents got divorced, if you were abused, if you experienced trauma, those are probably not your fault as a young person, but there is hope and there's remedy and there's reconciliation and there's victory that can be achieved, but you have to do it in the context of community.
Okay, so I'm going to play a contrarian for just a moment here, and then we'll come back to rites of passage. When you describe the dichotomy here, we have culture and then we have faith on the one hand. And it seems
Correct.
to me we could substitute there hedonism and self-control, largely, generally, right? So my question is this: is it possible to contain that self-control, to possess it without having faith? To abdicate or to step away from this culture that is promoting degeneracy and selfishness and just me narcissism. Is it possible to step away from that without religion, without faith?
I think there can have a certain amount of success, but not complete success. So let me tell you what I mean by that.
Okay.
Is that the human condition is incredibly self-deceptive, and as a result, we tend to think that we have the ability to do greater things than we really do. And when people look upon, and in the hedonistic culture, as the term that you used, it tends to be without any faith-based, without spiritual element. Well, here's the reality: is that humankind, we are spiritual beings, you know, and whether or not you believe that, we are. You know, you don't have to believe in something for it to not be for it to be true.
Yes.
So what happens is that when we understand that there's a spiritual element to us and that there are certain things that we are limited in terms of our own self-control and our own ability to conquer the destructive behaviors, only then can we recognize that we can have victory. And when you think about it, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, when it was first founded on the 12-step program,
Mhm.
one of the key pinnacles for that was recognizing that there is a God that gives you the power to do what your flesh cannot do. And if you look at in the Bible where it talks about what the fruits of the Spirit are, it talks about the works of the flesh and the works of the fruit of the Spirit. Works of the flesh include drunkenness and orgies and the lack of self-control and all these other things like that. But what the fruit of the Spirit is listed includes love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And if we recognize that the spiritual element of God gives us the ability to have victory where our flesh will always experience failure and defeat, only then can we have true victory. That's why, like, as I mentioned earlier, back in AA, when AA was kind of provoked to remove the God aspect of the 12-step program for that last step to be whatever you want it to be, they had the amount of recidivism really skyrocketed in that because there wasn't really a true foundation on the spiritual aspects of us as human beings. And so, can you have success? You can have some, but I don't think you can have the amount of success that is available to you if you recognize you're a spiritual being. And in order to be able to lean into that power, you have to have the power of the Holy Spirit to give you that self-control.
Well, I don't disagree with you that we are spiritual beings. I'm completely on board with what you're saying here. I find it very interesting that our culture, our secular culture, wants to promote secularism, right? It wants to promote atheism, this idea that there is no God. And I also think that everyone believes in something. If you say you don't believe in God anymore, you probably replace that faith with something like government, the state, maybe yourself, maybe self-love or whatever, almost idolatry. But I do believe that we all believe in something. That's just the nature of being human. I want to go back to what you're talking about with rites of passage. So the scholar Joseph Campbell talks a lot about the importance of rites of passage for boys. Now you were talking about it for your daughter and for girls, but it seems to me that what is especially lacking in our culture is something meaningful, something powerful and visceral for our boys to go through. Now, I'm familiar with being bar mitzvah, but it seems to me that that is more of at least in the modern conception of it, it's more of a symbolic gesture, right? They're not really going through something like, let's say, a vision quest in olden days where you had to starve yourself and find out if you were able to survive in the wild on your own. Now, that really proves to you that you're a man. On the other hand, if you're just getting a lavish party after studying Hebrew for several years, is that really making you a man? I'm not so sure. So, my question is, how can we provide something for our boys to go through that makes them feel like they're a man, that gives them the confidence and the self-worth to be the leaders of their household one day?
That's an excellent question. So, just to be clear, crop is not just for girls; it's for boys and for girls.
Sure.
The target range for age range for that is families that have somewhere between 11 and 15 year olds. Now, I'll take it back again to the spiritual aspect. If you look at the life of Jesus, we only know about him at three stages of his life. We know about him and about his birth. We know about his ministry years, death, resurrection, which is between the ages of 30 to 33. And the only other time we know about his life is when he was 12 years old in Luke chapter 2, verses 41 to 52. We don't know about him when he's 4, when he's 8 or 10. We don't know about him when he's 14 or 16 or 17 or 19 or 21 or 23 or 28. At 12. Why is that? What happened at age 12? I think that's in the book for a very specific reason to tell us this is when everything changes in a young person's life. And a lot of parents aren't ready for that. A lot of parents don't recognize this is the natural course of transitioning from a child into an adult. And so, what I propose to families is that what does it mean to be a man or what does it mean to be a woman? I propose that being an adult means that you are fully responsible for two things, and the only two things that you have total control over: your words and your actions. That's it. You have no control over what family you were born into, what you look like, what your features are, what your nationality is, what country you live in, whether you're rich or poor or somewhere in the middle, whether you're treated well or whether you're mistreated as a youth. You have no control over things that were said to you or things that were done to you, but you have total control over your words and your actions. And so that's what I say it means to be what it means to be an adult. And in terms of this adulting process, our culture has an absence of markers, that signify when a boy becomes a man and when a girl becomes a woman. Mm. And so, in the absence of those markers, what is it? Is it when they become a teenager because now they're a teen? Is it when they are able to vote, get their driver's license? Is it when they drink alcohol or get drunk for the first time? Is it when they get jumped into a gang? Is it when they lose their virginity? Is it what is it? When is it that boys become men and girls become women? What I propose to families is that I believe a boy becomes a man and a girl becomes a woman when their body physically is able to reproduce. Now, think about that for a second. When your body is able to physically create another human being, you have just been handed an adult responsibility on how you manage that. Doesn't mean you're mature, but it means that you have crossed over into the world of adulthood in controlling your words and controlling your actions. And so that's when I challenge the parents to say, we need to recognize that when our sons and daughters hit this age, we need to graduate them from the children's table and move them over to the adults table and mentor them on what it means to be an adult. Because if you mismanage those decisions on how you respond to sexuality or pornography or peer influences that are negative or substance abuse, I mean, granted, there is intrigue and there's mystery in those things as you transition into a young adult. But we have to understand that certain things that young minds aren't ready for, and that's our job is to prepare our kids for that. So that's what we do with crop. It's not just a religious procedural pronouncement. I now pronounce you a man. I now pronounce you a woman. But rather, it's a 1 year mentorship program where we meet on a regular basis and we mentor them on this whole process of learning to make decisions on many of the aspects that life will throw at them, so that at the conclusion of the mentorship program, there is a pronouncement of over our sons or our daughters. This is my son, this is my daughter in whom I'm well pleased.
Well, I want to return back to pornography for just a moment. So,
Sure.
my next question was going to be to you. Do you think the challenges that we face, that young people face today, are more difficult than the ones that your generation, my generation, went through? And before I do, I want to mention, because I think they definitely are, for at least talking about pornography, but there's so many more, and that's the ubiquitousness of how much pornography there is. Like when I was a kid, I remember a friend of mine had a nudie magazine, someone had a videotape or whatever, but it was very difficult to sustain that, to get it. But nowadays, you held up a phone a moment ago. I mean, anybody can really get online and get it immediately, and that by itself is one temptation that has huge implications, especially on boys growing up. It changes even the mental chemistry, the way that they view women, the way that they view the idea of having a household one day. So I would like you to talk, if you could, about the differences that I believe it's Generation Alpha that you're working with right now. What are they dealing with the different generations before them did not have? How are their challenges unique and different, and maybe even more difficult than what you and I may have faced when we were younger?
Yeah, well, the biggest difference is sexuality is on the front page of everything, not just of the media, but also in the school systems. We see our school systems teaching kids as young as kindergarten about sexuality and sexual identity and helping them recognize or try to reconcile if they feel they're gay or straight or trans or whatever it may be. We never ever dealt with that when we were that age. We never had it brought to us in the school systems, but it's in the school systems, it's in the media, it's on the social media. There's a outward celebration of people who identify as an alternative lifestyle. And so it's really the provocation of hypersexuality in our kids is something that you and I never really had to deal with. And again, it's all on demand here. And so that's what I have daughters, as I mentioned, they're now in their early to mid 20s, and them as well as a lot of girls under them, and many of the girls that I work with through the crop program, they mention how boys have this totally false expectation, which you alluded to, about what it means to how to treat a woman and how to their sexual expectations, especially when it comes to dating. It's completely skewed because of all of the exposure that young people have these days. And you and I know that boys are wired differently sexually than girls are. And so the constant drive and the desire and the demand for sexual fulfillment are young boys. There's nothing that prevents them from releasing that. And so what happens is that what they see being modeled in pornographic acts is totally different and unnatural within the context of a marriage relationship. And so that's really, really hurt again our nuclear family. That's why, like I said earlier, we see more pregnancies out of wedlock. We see more single family households. We see more biological dads who abandon their biological children because they want nothing to do with it. It was just a sexual act. And so that's a big problem that we have in our culture. And part of what I help our kids understand that go through the crop program is, listen, chances are really, really good that someday you, sons, will be a husband and you'll be a father. chances are really, really good daughters that someday you'll be a wife and someday you'll be a mother. And when that husband or wife, that mother, that parent that you want to be, doesn't start when you get married. It doesn't start when you have kids. It starts right now at this age, with the decisions that you make and the choices that you pursue, and understanding the societal impact that good choices versus poor choices can have in your life. The legacy that you will pass on to your kids is determined based upon what you decide right now. So rather than go through this wide path that leads to destruction, and then bring innocent kids along on that road, understand that destruction is what your enemy, your spiritual enemy, has in store for you. You've got to be aware of that so that you understand to fight back against it, and so that you can make good decisions, so that you can be the husband that your wife needs, or the wife that your husband needs, or the parent that your kids need. So that's a critical element in that mentorship process that I think is so critical, that's lacking today in our American families.
So I want to back up in a moment here. And so a big part of the porn problem is the screen problem, right? And
Yes.
that is because we're so used to having screens. And it doesn't begin with the children, it actually begins with the parents. So I want to give you a case scenario for you to tell me how you would deal with something like this. So I've seen this for many years, more than 10, where parents are at a dinner with their families and they're on their phones. They're at the park where their kids are playing, they're on their phones. And so the child watches the parent and begins to think that this is okay. Maybe not even at a conscious level, maybe it's at a subconscious level. And then little by little, that child in this example, let's say it's a 12-year-old boy, is introduced to porn because someone has a phone, one of their buddies, and they watch it, and now they're addicted to it. Okay? That's the problem. But the problem also is the fact that the parents are allowing that child to have a phone at age 12. They're allowing them to have screens all day long and all these different interactions. It seems to me that the issue for that child and for that family at this point wouldn't just be porn. To me, it would be a symptom of a larger problem, which is tech addiction, screen addiction. How would you counsel that 12-year-old who's going to leave your leave crop, spends an hour or two with you a week or whatever it is. He's going to leave that and go back to a home in which it's okay to constantly be on their phones and to be addicted to their screens, which of course leads to porn addiction through screens. How would you deal with that issue? Because it seems to me it's more complex than simply the pornography issue.
100%, yes. And so here's the reality: is numerous studies have been done on this, is that when we get on our phones, there is a dopamine release in our brains. And this dopamine release is the reward center. It's the same thing that we get when we're hungry and when we eat food. Somebody who takes drugs, somebody who looks at pornography. It's the reward center. And even us as grown adults tend to be drawn into this dopamine release that our phones give us. And so this whole thing, FOMO, fear of missing out.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh, it's not just in our teens. It's in our parents. It's in our grandparents, or many of our grandparents as well. So um, I think the key thing is to recognize that this instrument is the one that sets the standard on how we raise our kids. And like you mentioned earlier, if a 12-year-old sees his 28 or 32-year-old mother or whatever on their phone all the time, they're going to think that that's what normal is. And so what we as parents need to do is recognize a couple things. Number one, we're the adults here. We're the ones that get to choose what kind of lifestyle and what kind of household we raise our kids in. And the phone and the TV is the easy way out, because all we have to do is turn it on and walk away. We get back to our own thing. Some of the smartest, most well balanced, kindest, generous, mature kids I've ever known are kids that were raised that didn't have phones and didn't have televisions in their household. None. So what do? They read books, they drew, they made things, they got outside and walked in nature, they hung out with their friends, they rode their bicycles, they did things that are good for the programming of the brain, where it was active. Phones and screens are totally passive. So I think to answer your question, what can we do? Number one, parents, you have to recognize you're the adult. You get to control what goes on in your household and what happens. You set the example of of if you have a screen at dinner or not. If you have screens on at home, how long they're on or not. You get to control how, and until your child is 18 years old and a legal adult, it is totally within your realm to control how much time they spend on this phone. Now, keep in mind that you should have alternatives set up. So, for instance, understanding the unique rewiring of your kids, some kids are more academic, so make sure there's plenty of books for them to read as a result. Some kids are more artistic, so have things where they can draw or paint or be creative. Some kids are more relational, so make sure that you intentionally find other kids that are relational, and form groups of with other families where you have get together days, play days, whatever you might want to call them, where you can set up schedules. Hey, on this day, on this week, all of our kids are going to go to this household, and on the next week, they're all going to come to my household or whatever it may be. We have to be intentional on providing substitutes for the screens because numerous studies are out, and you know this about the damage that screens and media does to our kids. And we have to control what we can control, and that is the kids, the people that live in the four walls of our house.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I want to go back to a different case study. So we talked briefly about this idea. Let's say we have another 12-year-old here, and this time it's a girl. And she comes to you, Mark, and she says, I'm confused. I don't know if I'm a boy or a girl. I don't even know what my sexuality is. What advice or what do you do through your program to deal with that kind of challenge that a young person is facing?
I'll tell you that's timely because just a couple of months ago, I did a workshop on gender identity and gender confusion within young people. And there are a couple of things I shared in that workshop that I want to share with you right now. I'm going to go to my other screen here. But one of them was a research site called Statista. Anybody can look up Statista. It's a totally secular, non-religious. All they do is they survey and they research and provide results and report results of numerous trends that you can search on anything here in America, in different states, anywhere in the world. And this is the first thing I shared at that workshop is they did a study called the share of respondents who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in the United States over a 10-year period from 2012 to 2022. So, what percentage by generation I self-identified as LGBTQ? And they started out with the silent generation. The silent generation are those that were born in 1945 or before. And statistically, over that 10-year survey period, anywhere from 0.8% to just under 2% of that generation self-identified as LGBTQ. So anywhere from 1 to 2 out of 100.
Mhm.
Then they looked at baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964. That number was between 2% to 2.7%. So again, less than 3 out of 100. They moved on to Gen X's, which were born in 65 to 1980. And they found that between 2 to 4.5% self identified. They looked then at millennials, which are born in 1980 to 1996. They found between 5.8% and up to 11.2% self identified. And they finalized with Gen Z, not even Gen Alpha, but Gen Z, born between 97 and 2004. They found that about 22% I self-identified as LGBTQ. So about one out, just over 1 out of 5. And I think I've heard that the current statistic is about 30% self-identified. And so that is as a result of a lot of the influence that, like I mentioned, is really our kids are exposed to. Now, in conjunction with that figure, your question was, what can a parent do if a 12-year-old comes home? I saw this great presentation put on by a guy by the name of Frank Turek, who gave me some keen insights, who had some great insights on how to manage this. And I shared this in the workshop. The first thing is don't freak out. You know, Here's the reality is that when a parent freaks out, you have just trained your son and your daughter that you are not a safe person. Because who likes seeing their parent freak out? Nobody.
Mhm.
Nobody likes seeing their parent freak out. So you have to understand that you can't freak out no matter what your son or daughter come to, whether it's their a gender identity issue or anything else. You have to, as a parent, approach it calmly and try to help them through this. So here's what Frank Turek said. He suggested if somebody comes home and says, "Mom, Dad, I think I might be trans." First question is, well, what do you mean by trans? A lot of times kids will pick up on words or terms and they're maybe misappropriating what they think the definition of that is. So get your son or daughter to be thinking about what they mean by that. What do you mean by trans? Second question, how did you come to that conclusion? How did you come to that conclusion? What happened that made you feel this way? Get to the source of whatever that was that sparked this thinking in their mind to cause them to think that way. Fourth question, do feelings always tell the truth? You and I know that feelings don't always tell the truth. Their feelings can be deceptive. Fifth question, do feelings ever change? Feelings change constantly. I can be angry one moment and laughing the next moment, and vice versa. Sixth question, have you ever considered about 80% of people your age who have these feelings grow out of that by the age of 18? Think about it. I saw this thing, this scene talking about how this transgender issue has gone way, way too far. And it was a thing put on by, of all people, Bill Maher. And
Hmm.
he one of the things he mentioned is at the end is, when I was growing up, everybody wanted to be a cowboy or a ballerina. And so if that was the case, then everybody would be cowboys and ballerinas these days. He says, and then he goes on to say, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a pirate. Thank goodness nobody amputated one of my legs and gouged out one of my eyes for an eye patch because I identified as a pirate. Here's the reality is that a lot of kids grow out of that. So helping your kids think through those things is probably the best thing that they can do. Final questions is, how much have you read about long-term effects of transgender transitioning? There are a significant amount of effects of transgender transitioning. And in fact, a lot of young people, our culture, I should say, if you don't affirm your child's identity, they are at risk of having depressive or suicidal tendencies. What's better to do? Have a queer kid or have a live queer kid or a dead child? It's one of the arguments that are made. Almost 80% of people who identify as trans have either attempted suicide or considered suicide. So helping your sons and daughters reason through those things is the best thing that we can do as parents. But what does that mean? It means you have to be prepared and equipped to have these conversations, and you have to do it now before those things come your way.
When you talk about these things, we began by discussing that we're up against culture and faith, right? It seems to me that the stand that you're taking right now against these things, you have to be facing your own adversity. I could be wrong, but what pushback are you getting both in the culture, locally, regionally, nationally, or do you get any pushback? Are you finding that you're going against people that have entrenched interests against you? What has been the feedback that you've received?
Well, I haven't been exposed to pushback yet because so far the crop community that we've created have been people of faith. Now, granted, we've had families that have come through where the kids never professed a personal faith that was inconsistent with their parents, but through the program they wound up professing faith. Because I always share that child's faith cannot be their parents. It has to be their own. They have to make it their own. Because once they own their faith, then they'll own the requirements of that faith and understanding that the requirements of their faith are for our own good, not to take away things from us. Now, chances are that the time will come where I will be getting pushback from people who don't share that faith. That's okay. choose what life you want. I don't impose upon anybody, this is the life you must choose. But what I do share with people is that there is a better way, there's a better alternative. Jesus didn't come to condemn the world, but to save the world and to show that, hey, he loves us too much to leave us where we're at. And so that's part of what I try to share with parents is that you don't have to be a person of faith or a family of faith to participate in crop, but just come and listen. Maybe you've never been exposed to what a Christian perspective is. Maybe your exposure has been something where people did not live out their faith very well. In fact, outwardly poorly. And so maybe that's your understanding of what it means to be a Christian or live a Christian faith. Um, we invite people to be part of this and just learn this is the perspective because you're already getting the message of culture. All you have to do is turn on the TV, read the newspaper, fire up your phone, listen to music. The message of culture is there, imposing its system of beliefs and characteristics and values and behaviors upon you. Come and listen to the message of Christ and see that there might not be a better life that's available for you.
I have another case study question for you. So, when you talk about this stuff, I'm reminded of Dr. Phil and some of these other talk show hosts. It was a big thing in the late 90s, early 2000s, where they'd have these problem children come on. The mom and dad were clearly not with it. The kids would be, in gangs, doing drugs, promiscuity, all of that. Do you ever think there's a situation where someone would come to you with a child that's just out there, that there's no way to rein this person in? Is that ever a possibility that you might face?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I haven't experienced it within the context of crop because one of the things that we do with crop is not a program for you to drop your kids off and for us to fix them.
Okay.
A lot of parents want that. They want the easy fix. What crop is intended to do is to have the parent be their primary teacher, not the teachers at school, not the coaches on the sports field, not even the pastors at church, but the parent to be the primary teacher. And so as a result, you parent need to come and participate with your son or your daughter at every crop event that we do. Parent parents are not allowed to drop their kids off. We have too much of that in our culture already. And so what happens is that if you have a child who's really like gone off the rails, a lot of times parents will take the attitude of I've tried all I can, here, you fix them.
Mhm.
We're not equipped for that.
Okay.
However, there is an amazing program that I personally participated in. In fact, I went through it twice because it was so good. And it was a program that was actually written by school resource officers in high schools that dealt with kids who were dealing with drugs, who were dealing with gangs, who was dealing with aberrant behaviors, who were dealing with these things. And it taught parents how to impose love, but a good, healthy love. And as a result of that, they have some pretty hard measures, not hard measures in terms of being hard and in a physical way with the kids, but in terms of establishing hard boundaries so that kids who may be prone to violence and outward rebellion would have the opportunity to rein them back in. And all oftentimes refer people out to that program because this program is a nationwide program and it's really, really remarkable.
What if a family came to you and they said, I'm on board with everything that you're doing, but we are not Christian?
Sure. I
What
just
would you say?
100% invited, and what I tell them, I say, listen, we teach everything from a faith perspective. In fact, all of our lessons require a Bible memory verse each week for you to memorize that is tied into whatever that subject matter is for that week. It's up for you to determine whether you accept that or not. So you are invited to participate in our program as long as you come with an attitude of learning and an attitude of receiving what's being taught from this perspective. If you intend to participate in the program with nothing else other than being adversarial or being combative or anything else like that, this is not the program for you. We're not here to raise arguments and have fights and even argue against a doctrine. We don't talk about doctrine in it in terms of one faith versus another, or even one Protestant faith over another Protestant faith. In fact, getting to the issue of faith, when we talk about religions, and we do talk about world religions, these are the different world religions. This is what they believe. This is who founded them. This is when they were started. This is what they believe about adherence to that religious system and those who aren't. In fact, did you know that there's about 4,300 known religions that are in the world that we know about, different religious systems? About 4,300. And so, what I tell our teens, I say, listen, mankind, humankind, is really, really good at messing up a whole lot of stuff, including religion. And so, one of the ways we do that is we confuse people. And that's why nowadays we have 4,300 religions. But in reality, there's really only two. There's really only two if you boil it down to it. There are those that believe Jesus is who he said he is, and those who don't. You either believe he is who he said he is, or else you don't. And so that's the real clear demarcation point. Now, why Jesus? Why not any other religious leader throughout history? Well, because his credentials stand apart from anybody else. He's the only one that was predicted hundreds of times in terms of who he would be in terms of the Savior of the world, Messiah. He's the only one who, in company of eyewitnesses, both religious and non-religious writers, performed miraculous things, caused the lame to walk, the blind to see, the deaf to hear, the mute to speak, cast out demons, had control over nature, was even able to raise people from dead back to life. These were reported accounts, again, not just by religious writers and adherents, but also non-religious writers who lived at that time and reported these things. So if you're going to choose a team to be on, if you're going to sign up for a softball team, whose team do you want to be on? I want to be on that guy's team. And that's why we boil it down to that guy, that character, the person of Jesus, because he is unique and set apart from any other religious leader. And that's why you just boil it down to two. Do you believe he is who he said he is, or don't you?
Wonderful. I think that's a great place to leave it. So, Mark, if people are interested in learning more about your program and how to get involved, how can they do that?
Perfect. So, of course, they can go to our Crop Ministries website. It's cropministries.org, CROP, crop, Christian Rite of Passage, ministries, plural.org. You can get our contact information there. You can send us emails through there. We are a nonprofit. If you love what we're doing, I'm going to throw this quick pitch out for you to be able to help support us financially as well, because our desire is to gain and grow nationally. We've proven the concept locally. We've just completed the material so that we're available for nationwide distribution, but there's a pretty good expense to that. So I'd like to encourage people who believe in helping us raise this next generation, whether or not you have kids or grandkids of this age. Today's generation will impact your future. Today's generation are going to be your future voters, your future workers. They're going to be your future thought leaders. They're going to be the future writers. They're going to be for good or for bad. They're either going to take responsibility for themselves, or they're going to live self-centered lives of addictions and substance abuse. We have the ability to raise strong boys and girls, which is way, way better than fixing broken men and women. And so come to the website, cropministries.org. We also have a Facebook site. We'll continue to expand our online presence as we continue to get funding to help us to be able to grow that out. But that would be the best way for us to reach us.
Well, wonderful, Mark. Thank you for this great conversation today, and congratulations to all your success and what you're doing out there. It's really appreciated.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.